One of the most amazing things of having Sidney Blumenthal and Sean Wilentz join Legal AF a couple of weeks ago as our resident scholars and historians, putting everything we're watching in the Trump administration, the lawlessness, the abuse of power, the lurching from one constitutional crisis to the next in historical perspective, is that they come to us with a body of work. They formed something called Court of History, sort of a cheeky reference to the fact that there is a higher power above the United States Supreme Court, and history will be the judge, not only of the Trump administration, but those who either bent the knee to the Trump administration, enabled the Trump administration, or resisted against the Trump administration. Or as Judge Coffenor in Seattle, Washington said the first week of the administration, we don't want to look back and have people say during this era, this Trump era, of lawlessness and of rogue behavior, where were the lawyers and where were the judges? And that's the point. And the Court of History for Sidney and Sean is the highest court, even that above the United States Supreme Court. So their body of work, and because of their reputations in the field, attracts some amazing interviews and panelists. And I saw one recently, and I wanted to bring it back here on Legal AF because this one, it didn't get the views, it didn't get the interest that it should have when it wasn't on Legal AF. Let's be frank. This audience is fantastic and amazing and is yearning and thirsty for this kind of information. And Sean and Sidney, before they joined us, did an interview with Eric Swalwell, of course, on the House Judiciary Committee. And the three of them talked about constitutional violations of the Trump administration and statutory illegalities of the Trump administration's beginning and how they set the blueprint in the first few weeks, in those first 50 executive orders that we're now seeing in May and June, they're trying to reap the benefits from. So let's now tune into Sidney, Sean, and Eric Swalwell on Court of History right here on Legal AF.
I'm Sidney Blumenthal. The Court of History is a project that began about a year ago. I'm a co-founder with Sean Wilentz, who you'll hear from later. Our organization began by rebutting and correcting and deconstructing the false history of Supreme Court decisions on the theory of originalism and textualism. But we've moved on because events have moved on, and we find ourselves in a gathering storm, a dire threat to the American constitutional order. And that's what we're addressing here today. We've held previous webinars on Christian nationalism, on originalism, and just on the Friday before Trump's inauguration, we held one on the constitutional emergency. The conventional wisdom says that no one predicted what would happen, but if you can watch that video or read the transcript, I think you'll see that we had the outlines of what was to come. So today we're going to address the past, the present, and look forward to the future with people who are directly involved in all of those dimensions. We're dealing now with the destruction of our constitutional order. We are at the beginning of what Russell Voigt, now the head of the Office of Management and Budget, calls the post-constitutional order. We've entered it. This is nothing less than a reversal, piece by piece, a demolition of American progress through our history. This is not only a war on the Constitution, but by that also a war on history. We can see it in the destruction of the civil service, which began with the Pendleton Act after the assassination of President Garfield, and was built through crisis after crisis in our history, through the Progressive Era, the New Deal, the Great Society, and onward. We see the attack on birthright citizenship, the 14th Amendment, which, as Ulysses Grant called it, the results of the war, meaning the Civil War. That was the legacy of Lincoln. We see it in the statement by Vice President J.D. Vance, who has stated that judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. That's an attempt to nullify Marbury versus Madison, the concept of judicial review, a fundamental assault on the integrity of the American judicial system and the rule of law. And now we have a president who says he is above the law, that he is a king. He says he who saves his country does not violate any law. I don't know where he got that quote. It is attributed to Napoleon, but the Napoleon it's attributed to was a character in a Soviet-financed 1970 movie. And someone gave Trump, and if the quote fits, wear it. We're now seeing issue by issue, crisis after crisis, from the firing of the Secretary of Special Counsels, of inspectors generals, of a crisis of impoundment, stamping on the authority of the Congress, the wholesale firing of civil servants based on the so-called DOGE, non-department of government efficiency, run by the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, and his minions. We are inundated by the Eric Adams affair of offering the end of a prosecution in return for political favors, a Watergate 2 in our time, undoubtedly ordered by Trump. No different in a way from the blackmail of Volodymyr Zelensky that led to Trump's first impeachment, by the way, of offering missiles in exchange for dirt on Joe Biden. So Trump's statement that he who saves his country does not violate any law is, of course, a restatement of what Richard Nixon said in his infamous interview with David Frost, that when the president does it, it's not illegal. But it's also, in its own way, a restatement of the Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity, in which the court ruled a former president is entitled to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. So in a way, what we're seeing is the fruit of the poison tree. Ketanji Jackson, a justice of the Supreme Court, warned that Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity declared for the first time in history that the most powerful official in the United States can, under circumstances yet to be fully determined, become a law unto himself. And that is the storm we are in. To address it, past, present, and future, we have a sterling array of panelists. Let us begin with Bradley Moss, attorney for the FBI Agents Association. He is in the middle of the FBI agents fighting back against the Trump administration's efforts to fire and control the agency for its own political ends. And he can explain it. Brad specializes in matters relating to national security, federal employment, and security clearance law, and the Freedom of Information Act and the Privacy Act. So we welcome to the Court of History, Bradley Moss.
Thank you, Sidney, and thank you everyone for watching, observing, and of course, thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm very much the junior amongst these three. These guys are legends in their own right. What I want to address, and I want to keep this short so we can get to Q&As eventually, is sort of where we stand right now with the various pieces of litigation being brought by individual employees and parts of the agencies to push back against what we're seeing come out of Elon Musk and his Doge kids. What our litigation by, for example, what Sidney was referencing is being brought by several unnamed FBI officials. These aren't just agents. It's forensic examiners, technical specialists, any number of people who performed work in some fashion or another on January 6th related cases, as well as the FBI Agents Association, of course, bring a suit to stop the distribution of names of all the individuals who performed work. The U.S. government, specifically through an executive order set forth now in memos from the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, collected names of everybody in the FBI who had performed work on January 6 cases. Not necessarily saying they had done anything wrong, but just all the names. And it was with the clear intent to publish this at some point, put it out on Twitter through Elon Musk, and let the doxing and shaming begin and put those people at risk. Those names are supposed to be kept private for the most part. The overwhelming majority of federal employees' identities are kept private to avoid that type of harassment. For the moment, we have a consent order temporarily keeping that information private, but we'll see coming up very soon, because there's ongoing fights between us and the government on this point, to what extent that injunction, that temporary order, stays in place. But it speaks to a larger issue we're seeing across the spectrum, not just in that case, of any number of different parties across different agencies, whether it's USAID, whether it's Department of Education, if it's nuclear regulatory folks, it's Department of Defense, DHS. They're all getting gutted like this right now with these consultants, special government employees, whatever you want to call them, out of DOJ, walking in, demanding and being granted access to the most inner parts of their data systems, getting all kind of information on you, me, our finances, our educational data, our health data, and deciding for themselves what is fraud, what is waste, and pushing aside anyone and everyone who tries to get in their way. Security officials meant to safeguard classified information are being pushed aside. People, at the Social Security Administration, at the IRS, meant to safeguard your private information there, have been pushed aside. It is a very delicate moment we stand right now in this situation, and it's because the system was never designed for a president like Donald Trump in mind. It was designed with the idea that there would always be a president who would care about rules, who would care about laws and ethics and principles, and ultimately did not push that boundary. Donald Trump has made it very clear. He'll push every boundary he can. He'll assert as much Article 2 authority as he sees fit, and he'll continue to do it in this sort of let's just do it and be legends approach until someone can push back. Congress has made sure and made clear they have no intention of doing so, certainly not the current majorities. The courts have limited abilities to do so. You're seeing some of the limits of that ability. We saw it today with Judge Chutkan denying a temporary restraining order in one of the cases against Elon Musk and DOJ, saying you might have a good, colorable legal argument to eventually shut down DOJ under the appointments clause. And I'm sure Professor Vladeck will get into that. But you haven't proven in your particular case imminent irreparable harm with injury specifically tied to you, the plaintiffs, which were various states that were bringing this lawsuit. Courts are not designed to be this all-encompassing fix. They're designed to be narrow and limited bodies of jurisdiction, but they are right now the best and last course of defense as we slowly push back and as the public realizes the extent of what's going on. With that being said, I look forward to hearing from the other panelists, and I certainly look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Brad. And I should note that if you have questions, look at the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can put in your questions, and we will raise them during the Q&A session. Brad raised the question of what Congress can do as well. And later in this webinar, we will hear from Congressman Eric Swalwell from his district. But now I would like to introduce Stephen Vladeck, who is a professor at Georgetown Law School, a nationally recognized expert on the federal courts. You may have seen him this Sunday on 60 Minutes. He is also an expert on national security law and military justice. He's an author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Shadow Docket, How the Supreme Court Uses Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic. And I now turn it over to Steve. Take your time, Steve, as you go through where we're at.
Sure. So thanks again, Sidney, to you and to Sean for organizing this. I mean, I think this is an important conversation. I guess I want to take a minute to sort of piggyback on Brad's comments and try to put into context where I think what we're seeing is differences in degree between the current administration and prior presidencies, and where what we're seeing is really different in kind. Because I think it's easy, given all the headlines, to lump some of those together, and I think it's important to actually try to keep them separate. So, the Supreme Court we have, for better or for worse, has made a number of steps in the last 15, 20 years to move our sort of understanding of executive power increasingly toward what's known as the unitary executive theory of Article 2. We could have a separate conversation about why that move of itself is problematic and rests on some pretty one-sided understandings of constitutional history. But what I'd like to do actually is take that move as a bit of a given and explain why what Trump is doing in a lot of these respects goes well past even the most, I think, aggressive views of the unitary executive the Supreme Court has endorsed. So when we talk about the term the unitary executive, it's really not an especially sophisticated idea. It is a reference to the very first clause of Article 2 of the Constitution, often known as the vesting clause, which vests the, quote, executive power of the United States, unquote, whatever that is, in a single president. So unlike Congress, which has 535 members, unlike the courts, which, we're always going to have more than one, at least, judge, here we have a unitary person who is wielding all this power. What that means is sort of different things depending upon the context. What we're seeing, especially in the first month of the Trump administration, is a more aggressive reliance upon the theory that as the unitary executive, the president has absolute and unfettered control over every single person who works for the executive branch. And it might help to think about folks who work for the executive branch as falling into one of three categories. So there are the sort of top level folks who work for the executive branch, who the Supreme Court calls principal officers. And the best example of these are cabinet secretaries. Although these folks have to be confirmed by the Senate, everyone understands that they are nominated by the president and that they serve at the president's pleasure. And so were Congress, for example, to try to interfere with how the president could remove, for example, the Secretary of Defense, that would be unconstitutional. And indeed, the Supreme Court has held some version of that since 1927. The middle level, which the Supreme Court calls inferior officers, is a little trickier. So in 1988, in a case called Morrison versus Olson, the Supreme Court said it is constitutional for Congress to impose for-cause removal restrictions on inferior officers, on sort of the folks just below the principal officers. But that decision, Morrison versus Olson, has been something of a bête noire for conservatives. They hate it. I think the court would not necessarily balk at a chance to overrule it. But there's still this third category, which is non-officer employees and contractors, which, as you might imagine, is the vast majority of the people who actually work for the executive branch. And here, at least since the 1880s, and especially since the 1970s, there have been a raft of statutory protections for what we call the civil service, for folks who are employed by the federal government in non-policymaking positions, whether they're scientists or custodians or line attorneys. I mean, it really runs the gamut. The flip side of all of this is that what is novel about what Trump is doing is the power he's asserting in this third category, right? That this third category is where historically presidents have not tried to commandeer hiring and firing authority, and historically the courts have not suggested they can. That is where I think we've seen, at least from a bureaucracy standpoint, things run the most off the rails in that space. The problem is that the first lawsuit that's reached the Supreme Court is about someone in that first category. So Hampton Dellinger, who runs the Office of Special Counsel, whether he's a principal officer or an inferior officer, he's the head of an agency. And the argument that the president should be allowed to fire him even though Congress has created for-cause removal restrictions, is probably the strongest argument Trump is going to have in any single one of these cases. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the Justice Department has rushed this one case to the Supreme Court. They know it's their best chance. And so I wrote about this actually in my Substack newsletter on Monday, 1/1, about why we should not assume that the first case the Supreme Court already has about these Trump policies is going to be a bellwether. Is actually a radical outlier that even if Trump wins, I think won't tell us much about where the court's going to be. That's because in addition to the sort of the employee level actions where I think the president's on very weak footing, the other massive sort of systemic thing that Trump is doing is basically arrogating Congress's appropriations power. We're seeing some of that with the DOJ stuff that Brad was referring to. We're also seeing it through the spending freezes that are being challenged in court. And this is where even the most ardent zealots of the unitary executive theory get off the train, right? So if you go back to when William Rehnquist, the former Chief Justice, was in the Nixon Justice Department, he wrote a memo about how this is not something the president can do by himself. The power to appropriate and the power to dictate spending belongs to Congress. For Rehnquist to say that was a big deal. He wasn't alone. In 1985, a junior White House lawyer named John Roberts wrote a memo about how this is not something that the president can do by himself. In 1988, the Office of Legal Counsel, the branch of the Justice Department that tends to be more sympathetic to claims of executive power than any other office and any other agency in the government, wrote a memo saying this is not something the president can do. So I think it's important, if we're going to try to put this into a legal setting, to separate out the sort of the top line stuff Trump is doing that he's probably going to win on, like firing people like Hampton Dellinger, and the overwhelming majority of what the administration is doing, which is not consistent with the unitary executive theory, and which I think the courts are eventually going to block. Now, at this point, you might be saying, this is the same Supreme Court that just gave President Trump immunity from criminal prosecution for the January 6th case. How can you say such things about the court? Why are you so naive, Professor Vladeck? And my response is, I'm not naive, at least on this. I'm naive in my Mets fandom. But I'm sort of pragmatic, which is that this is a court that understands that it is the only thing standing between Trump and control of the entire federal government, right? That with a Congress that is showing absolutely no interest in pushing back against Trump at all, I think this is a court that's going to want to find opportunities to push back, whether it's on appropriations and impoundment, whether it's on civil service interference, whether it's on spending, whether it's on DOJ, whether it's on birthright citizenship. And so, it's not that I think this court is going to draw the line where I would. I actually think the statute protecting Hampton Dellinger from being fired is constitutional. It's that they're going to draw a line. And I know there's been a lot of sort of stuff in the water about Trump maybe ignoring a decision from the courts. I think that we're not even close to that yet. So I guess, Sidney, my bottom line is a lot of really bad things are happening. We are in a very bad place politically. The courts, I think, so far are actually doing pretty darn well. But I also think we're seeing the limits of what we can reasonably expect courts to do. Courts can say these things are illegal, but it's going to take more than the courts to save us. And so even though I'm sort of cautiously optimistic that the Supreme Court in cases that are coming, as opposed to the case that's already there, is going to push back against Trump, I think we also have to be realistic that even that is not going to stop the flood of what's happening. And that what we really need is some kind of shift in public understanding of what the federal government does. So the last thing I'll say before turning it over to Sean, President Reagan made a big deal out of the sort of the most horrifying sentence in the English language being, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you." we have to actually remind people that that's always been wrong, that the federal government is here to help us in dozens of ways, from the safety of our medications to the safety of our food, to the safety of our highways, to the safety of our aviation system. Oh, by the way, to any number of other things, to the integrity of our Social Security benefits, to the privacy of our tax information. I mean, there are just so many things the federal government did quietly behind the scenes with no fanfare that our society actually has come to depend upon. And until and unless there's a groundswell of support publicly, not just from folks who already think Trump has authoritarian tendencies, but from folks who voted for him, I think the courts are going to do a lot of good things, but they can't do it all. And I think that's where I will stop.
Thanks, Steve. And I will say as a comment that I don't think you're necessarily naive about the Mets because you have Juan Soto now. I'd like to introduce a Yankees fan now.
Thank you so much for that observation, Sidney. Rub it in.
Sean Wilentz is professor of American history at Princeton University. He's the author of The Rise of American Democracy and many other works. He is the co-founder of the Court of History. And Sean is going to explain to us where we are in terms of the history of executive power and what the predicate is for what Trump is now doing and what the current explanations of it are in terms of justifying his actions really are, and whether or not they have any standing as historical fact. And I turn it over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Sid, and thanks to Brad and to Steve. I'm going to be the historian to talk about the precedents. I'm going to talk about the things that Steve is optimistic, cautiously optimistic, and I want to share that. But I'm going to give you what they have been talking about. That is to say, that the administration has been talking about in terms of the limitations or the lack of limitations on executive power and the kinds of misuse of history that they've invoked in order to justify that. And look at a bunch of presidents that are ordinarily invoked in that respect. I must say that Ronald Reagan, that line of Ronald Reagan's that Steve quoted, has resonated down through the decades, and I think is the single most destructive thing that Ronald Reagan did, which was to basically delegitimize the federal government. And we're paying for that in all kinds of ways. However, the presidents I want to talk about did not delegitimate the federal government, quite the opposite. They argued very forcefully for a federal role. However, they've been cited mostly by Vice President Vance, actually, but cited again and again and again as examples of how untrammeled executive power ought to be. The primary example actually is the most egregious and the one I know the most about, which is President Andrew Jackson. It said, Steve Bannon put it in Trump's head that he ought to govern like Andrew Jackson. I guess that's not operable anymore because he's supposed to be talking about William McKinley, but never mind. William McKinley had nothing to do with executive power in particular, but Andrew Jackson did, but not in the ways that it's been invoked. It's been said that Jackson showed contempt for the Supreme Court. Now, Jackson's in sort of bad odor these days with a lot of historians, and some people actually say that this is true. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. And the case that's most often cited has to do with his Indian policy. Now, we can say what we want about Andrew Jackson's Indian policy. That's an argument we can have on many different levels. But at the level of executive privilege, executive power, the claims that are being made, especially by Vice President Vance, are it's not just bogus history, it's just lie history, it's false history. It mostly concerns about a line that was attributed to Andrew Jackson, in which after a Supreme Court case involving Georgia and the Cherokees, he said supposedly, or was attributed to him, that he said that Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, which meant, as Vice President Vance and others have said, or supposedly they take it to mean, that he was defying the court. Let the court say what it wants. We're going to do differently. This had absolutely nothing to do with the case, the case that we're talking about. First of all, Jackson never said that. He did not utter those words. He wouldn't have uttered those words because he was not in a position to enforce anything in the particular case that we're talking about. The case is that of Worcester v. Georgia. To sum it up briefly, the Marshall Court did indeed declare all of Georgia's state laws regarding the Cherokee unconstitutional, and also was going to free a couple of missionaries. It had nothing to do with Andrew Jackson or the president's powers. It had to do with what Georgia could not do. Jackson's sympathy certainly was not with the Indians, but this had nothing to do. What he was observing had nothing to do with executive power. The idea that's been floated that this was an example of what Trump ought to do if the court rules against him, that he ought to defy the court and say, Justice Roberts has made his decision, now let him enforce it. This is completely, egregiously a bogus example. But there are others that get floated from time to time. That of Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, we know this, that Abraham Lincoln did indeed suspend habeas corpus. And so therefore, people think that the president has the right to do a lot of things. Yeah, well, there was a civil war going on when Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. There was an emergency of the highest order when he suspended habeas corpus. The rule was that he could not suspend habeas corpus without congressional approval. Congress was not in session when this emergency arose. So he went ahead and did it in order to prevent the country from falling apart. But then as soon as Congress came back into session, he had Congress approve his suspension of habeas corpus. This is not an abject, refusal to obey the Constitution, let alone an abject gutting of the Supreme Court's powers. Not at all. Other examples are given. FDR, it's often cited, that he extended federal power, presidential power with regard to the Japanese internment. As we know, there was a case badly decided, it's subsequently been decided, but nevertheless, there was a case that he was not defying the Supreme Court whatsoever. There is one president, however, that you might look to justify what Trump is talking about or what his people are talking about, and that president will be Richard Nixon. That's the bad example. There's the example out there of a president who is trying to do what Trump is trying to do now, or says he's trying to do now, in terms of expanding executive power. Back up for a second. Executive power has waxed and waned over the course of American history, but we're not talking about the relative, importance of executive power. We're talking about what the constitutional limits are, and it's very clear from the Watergate investigations that Nixon had it very much in mind to concentrate power in the federal government so that he could use it as a weapon against his political enemies. That's what the Houston Plan was all about. That's what all of the investigations that eventually ended up with Judge Sirica, that's what that was about. Now, that was stopped. It was stopped by a hair's breadth in many ways. At all sorts of points along the way, it might have gone differently. But it was stopped. What we're seeing now in many ways is an extension, actually, of the worst excesses of what Nixon planned to do. In some ways, I suppose the continuity of Roger Stone has something to do with this here. But nevertheless, he's taking what Nixon, in his wildest dreams, might have hoped to have done. He was stopped doing. That is what Trump is up to these days. It has nothing to do with Andrew Jackson. It has nothing to do with Abraham Lincoln, and it certainly has nothing to do with FDR. So, from an historian standpoint, this is, we have lots of bogus history. The Court of History has been talking, Sid and I have been talking about the bad history that's gone into the originalist decisions, the bad history that clutters things up in sort of a way that it seems to have authority, claims authority. Many people who don't know much about American history cower in the face of all of that. They think, oh, well, there is historical authority for all of this. This is junk history. It's just as much junk history with regard to the Trump claims about executive power as the originalist decisions were, the originalist claims about history that we've seen over the last, many decades, but certainly over the last couple of sessions of the Supreme Court. So with that little history lesson, I will turn it back over to you, Sid, and we can open up conversation. I don't know if Congressman Swalwell's here or not, but maybe we can just keep on going.
Well, thanks, Sean, for elucidating the history that explains partly where we are and the false rationales that are being used to try and cover it as well. There's a kind of historical cover-up going on that goes back to other cover-ups. Congressman Swalwell will join us shortly, but I think we have time to discuss some of the questions. People have a lot of questions, and if you have more, raise them. I don't want to use people's names here if people who ask the questions don't mind. But one question is, and I think I would like to start with Brad. What's the consequence for employees, federal employees, refusing to cooperate with DOJ? Certainly, there's a crisis at the FBI, and the questioner asks, are Musk's people pointing guns at them? Are they threatening to arrest them? What are they doing in terms of threats? There's another question here. Why are people turning over access to systems and not standing their ground? And I would raise that question after Brad answers the first part to Steve in regards to Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent, who opened up the Treasury to Musk's minions. But Brad, if you could explain what's going on with the FBI people, and tell us a little bit about the narrative and how is it that the FBI became the enemy within?
Well, the FBI has been a target of Donald Trump ever since 2016, 2017. He'll never forgive them for Crossfire Hurricane. He'll never forgive them for the probe into his campaign's interactions with Russian nationals and what they understood to be or thought to be Russian influenced groups trying to funnel information to them and help their campaign against Hillary Clinton. But to go to the question of how DOJ is pulling this off, no, they're not holding guns against people. What they have done is essentially a twofold approach. One, they show up with a whole bunch of badges and accesses saying, we are XYZ person. I have this badge. I'm from the White House. Give me access to this, this, and this. When the initial folks at the agency say, we don't know who the heck you are, get away, they call the agency official, the head of the agency leadership, who are all acting officials and political appointees from Donald Trump. Those officials call over and say, give these guys the access. I'm authorizing it. When security or HR or the systems engineers, the ones start allowing access, but then try to curtail it, these kids have even gone as far as saying, I'm calling Elon Musk. Elon's going to bring in the U.S. Marshals to arrest you if you don't allow me access to this. I'm authorized. Give me the access. And what you've essentially seen is the people who you would expect to stand up and say, no, you're not getting access to this. This is root, code access to the IRS database, to, health records, to education records, the Social Security records. You're not getting this. The people who initially stood up were all put on administrative leave or fired, and they were pushed out. So they were no longer there to stand up. And so the next group came in and they got pushed aside if they stood up. So what Trump has done essentially is to give the veneer of credibility to DOJ by sending them in there. And when they get pushback, just having political leadership call in and saying, I'm authorizing it, give them everything they ask for. And so that's how they're pulling this off. The silver lining is that for the most part, this hasn't veered into classified issues. There have been parts where they've come up to the line where they've granted themselves access to systems or facilities that would implicate that. They haven't actually gone so far as to get into it yet that we know of, but that's the next step. Is if they've already gone through the easy stuff, they already went through USAID and education. They're already going through Social Security Administration and IRS. Those are non-classified matters. Now we're going to get into the really nasty stuff, the true, seedy parts of the government, the deep state. That's all classified stuff. Those are in facilities with various procedures to get into a SCIF, to get into a secure room, to access certain certain databases. those kids have no hesitation to call in the agency leadership, to call in the president to say, give me access. Doesn't matter if they've never been properly vetted. Doesn't matter if they even have the proper security clearance investigations. As far as they're concerned, as far as the White House is concerned, if Donald Trump orders it, they're getting it.
Well, I should note that some of the attendees of this webinar want to know if this will be recorded, and it is being recorded. We will provide a YouTube link to it at the end. Everyone who has attended will receive it and a transcript. So, Steve, if you could speak to cabinet officials, agency heads. Some people have resigned. They have not. They have refused to allow Doge and Musk in. Others have opened the door, and there are lawsuits about all this. Where do we stand with all this? What does this mean for them?
I mean, I think the problem is that I think the administration has been much more ruthless this time around than it was, 8 years ago, in putting folks into these senior positions who are not going to cause any trouble. I mean, it's remarkable that we're yearning for the days of Attorney General Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr, but I think we are, right? So, it's one thing to have someone who was appointed by President Biden or even a first-term President Trump who, has enough of a backbone to say, no, I won't do this, and either resigns or is fired. But it's quite another to think that the folks Trump is putting in now are being put in without a sort of clear understanding that they are yes men and yes women, that they are there to do the president's bidding. And I think what's really the place where this is really encapsulated, you had mentioned, Sidney, briefly the sort of the contretemps over Mayor Adams in New York. I think if folks read nothing else, you should read the memo that the acting Deputy Attorney General Emil Bove sent to the U.S. Attorney in New York, Danielle Sassoon, a conservative Republican who clerked for Harvey Wilkinson on the Fourth Circuit and Justice Scalia, in which he said, you committed insubordination because you did what you thought the law required as opposed to what was in furtherance of the president's policies. That is insane. And it's insane that he wrote that down. And so, my concern, Sidney, is that you have this broader phenomenon of executive branch officials who are being put in by the president now who don't have those same principles. And, historically, the check on that has been the confirmation process in the United States Senate. I think we've seen exactly how Senate Republicans, right, have ceded and surrendered their responsibility in this space, which puts that much more pressure, Sidney, back on the courts.
Yeah, well, you raised Congress, and at that moment emerges Congressman Eric Swalwell, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, who can give us a firsthand account of what the Democrats in the Congress are doing. Many people wonder, what are the Democrats up to? What can they do? What's possible? What's going to happen? And we're very appreciative that Congressman Swalwell has made time to appear here, and we look forward to his remarks right now.
Thank you, Sidney, and thank you, Steve, for the presentation and rundown. I'm headed to a town hall in my district, and just to set the table for you as to what's going on in our districts across the country, we noticed this town hall about 10 days ago, and within an hour, all 500 spots that were available in this auditorium were ticketed with 1,000+ wait list today. And people are very anxious. They're fired up. They are asking the same question that Sidney just asked. What are the Democrats going to do? They don't want you to say that you're powerless or you're helpless. They want to know. And if they don't see leadership, a mob-like mentality, that is not going to be as purposeful and effective, is at risk of forming. And so these folks want to be led, and they're counting on us to lead them. And my approach first has been to acknowledge why people are so upset. They just ran a 26.2 mile marathon, and at the finish line, they're punched in the gut and are being told, okay, keep your running shoes on. You've got another 26.2 miles ahead, and we need you to start sprinting. My approach to this is that we can't wear people out and take on fights that we cannot win this early on, because there are actually fights that we can win, seats that we're going to have to win in the coming year in the off-year elections, a Wisconsin Supreme Court election, which has consequences and stakes for a lot of what we're doing. And then, of course, and the nearest term fight that we can win is upcoming funding of the government. And we have seen over the last couple of years that Republicans have been completely incapable of putting the votes together, even when in the majority, to fund the government. And so you saw over Speaker Johnson and Speaker McCarthy's first term in the majority that every time government funding was provided, the majority of the votes came from the minority party. You've never seen that in the history of any Congress where a vote of substance was passed because the minority party delivered the majority votes. You've never seen that in any parliament across the world. And so the margins only got tighter in this Congress. We picked up 10 seats in the House. When we go to that vote, very likely it's going to be 217 Republicans, 215 Democrats. So they cannot lose a single vote. And they start with 30 to 50 members of the Freedom Caucus who will say that no cut is deep enough and that they're not going to support any budget unless their demands are met. You have 8 to 10 members who are in Kamala Harris districts where she won, but a Republican holds the district. And many of those are in California and New York, where we picked up 6 seats across both states. And so they're going to have to put up the votes. And also, by the way, they need at least 7 Democrats in the Senate. So what is the trap here that you're already starting, to hear from the press? Are the Democrats willing to shut down the government, to get transparency from Trump and Musk, to unfreeze federal funding that goes to our communities, to put FBI agents back on the watch for terrorism? Are you willing, to kill the hostage, so to speak, that you've never been willing to kill before? That's a trap, and we should avoid it. And the best way to frame it is the truth. The Republicans are shutting down the government as we speak. When you lay off en masse nearly 100,000 people, you're shutting down the government. When the National Cancer Institute lays off 300 people, you're shutting down our best shot at cures. When the FBI is in mass gently on Donald Trump's cases, you're making us less safe and you're shutting down our safety. So we have to frame it in a way that they have already shut down the government. And so if they can't continue to run the government among themselves with their majorities, they're going to have to come to us. And I don't think we should be party to any vote that continues this madness. And if they do need our votes, what I would recommend is, of course, and I'll leave it to Hakeem on our side to negotiate specifics and even the top lines. But at the very minimum, I would not give them more than 30 days funding at a time. Because if we strike a deal for 6 to 9 months of government funding, you can count on them to walk away from the deal. And we will truly look weak and as if we squandered the only leverage we have, which is that we can be unified when we need to be, and as we've shown over the past couple of years. And so I think that's the first fight where if we stay united and say we're not going to be a part of this continued madness, this abuse of our constituents and our Constitution, we will have real leverage as we take on that fight. And then by showing we're willing to be united and stand up to protect people, to protect their healthcare, to protect their safety in their communities, to protect their retirement security. If we show that fight in us, what we're going to do is we're going to fire up and inspire candidates in the hardest districts across America to believe that they should join the fight and run for Congress. Because that decision is being made right now in Omaha, in Orange County, on Long Island, where we can win and expand the pickup that we had in the last election. We need the highest caliber candidates to self-recruit right now and believe that the sacrifice that they're going to go through, what they're going to put their families through, is worth it because a majority is achievable. So that's how I'm looking at this near-term fight. And then the midterm need to have warm water so that we can recruit the best candidates. And then long-term, it seems to me that this is going to be a pretty simple message that we're going to take to voters in 2 years. And for Democrats, it's kind of, dance with the one that brought you. Our issue, we are most trusted by the voters on healthcare. And it looks like Trump and Musk, to pay off their promises on tax cuts, are going to have to raid Medicaid, Medicare, and probably make changes or try and gut the Affordable Care Act. And so we are seen as guardians of healthcare. And that is our issue. And we're going to have to own it. And the last Trump presidency, his lowest approval rating was not on January 6th. It was when he tried to take away the Affordable Care Act. That is still something that Americans treasure, their healthcare costs, and they expect us to stand up for it. So that's kind of the state of play that I see, Sidney. That's how I have engaged with my colleagues. And right now, you know, we're all home doing town halls. And I imagine when we report back to Washington on Monday, we all will have heard the same thing, which is we don't feel safe. We need you to protect everything that we hold dear. And so I'll kick it back to you, Sidney. Happy to answer some questions.
Well, Eric, here's some questions that people are concerned with. They have obviously wanted to know what are the Democrats doing in Congress? Where are they? And they don't have the horizon that you've just presented of the budget fight. And they need to focus on what the coming events are that have not yet happened. At the same time, you describe the Democratic caucus as unified and the Republican conference as fractured. And that's something that people need to understand as well. And a further point, which goes to the constitutional heart of this matter, which is that the Republican leadership and the Republicans in the Congress as a whole are complicit and subservient to the Trump administration's fundamental violation of the congressional power of appropriation and are agreeing to the impoundment of funds. And those funds include programs already appropriated to benefit the American people. And then when you make another agreement, will those Republicans agree that those funds, if they benefit the American people, will not be impounded? And that is a further question that can be posed to them. So
that's one of my, so Sidney, yes, that would be one of my just basic requirements to vote, to continue government, would be that you spend the money that we already voted and a president signing the law that requires you to spend. And by the way, and we must socialize this more, a lot of this money goes into Republican districts. And so they're self-sabotaging their own constituents because through the community funded projects that are passed in a bipartisan way, every member gets to submit about 15 to 20 different projects between $1 to $3 million. And they fund public safety programs, they fund addiction programs, they fund healthcare programs, they go after and attack homelessness. Some of them are transportation programs. And so it truly is self-sabotage, as you said, in service entirely to Donald Trump. What are we doing, you asked, elsewhere in Congress? Well, we had a hearing last week in the Judiciary Committee titled The Censorship Industrial Complex, which again is very rich because it was held within 24 hours of Donald Trump kicking the Associated Press out of the White House for not calling the Gulf of America, for not calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. And so we did not take the bait. We had a meeting the night before, a 9:00 meeting with Professor Raskin, and he organized all of us and made sure that we were focused on what Americans were promised. They were promised cheaper eggs, and that hearing was going to show they were just getting cheaper talk. And so most of us in our questioning went to the cost of goods, because Donald Trump is losing on that right now. And so that will also be, in addition, as I said, to wanting to gut healthcare, he has set himself up where he has to deliver cheaper eggs, so to speak. And eggs, as a representation of just everything we are spending money on in the economy. So we really have to be, as I said, disciplined in our approach here. And going back to what I said, to start picking the fights that we can win. And we're on pretty solid ground on that one.
Yeah. The rationale for DOGE is that it is going to deal with waste, fraud, and abuse. That's their claim. Their very name is government efficiency. What is the answer to that? And there are two other corollaries to that. One is, what is the self-interest of the people who are pursuing DOGE, including Musk himself? And two, what areas of government are they not looking into where there's actually waste, fraud, and abuse?
Yeah. I believe on DOGE, we have to remember that every American will view this issue through their own experience and their own expenses. And so I agree with you, having transparency on who's working on DOGE, understanding the conflicts of interest, putting into a government funding agreement, guardrails on that, absolutely important. But I would take it back to the essence of its mission. Show us the savings. They have not produced any evidence of any savings of what they're doing, but they certainly have presented a number of vulnerabilities for our own data, for our privacy. And so I think we need to have a high pressure campaign on them. Show us the savings. Show us the money that has actually been saved through what you're doing. And then to your point, and is any of that worth it if people who are seriously conflicted and will greatly benefit and enrich themselves are the ones conducting the cuts?
Steve, I wonder if you had a question for Congressman Swalwell.
Congressman, thanks for taking the time.
Yep.
I guess I just, I'm curious about the sort of your assessment of your colleagues across the aisle when it comes to what would be a red line for them. Because, we haven't really seen one yet. And, obviously there are plenty of folks on the other side who are going to do whatever the president wants. But I'm curious if, in your private conversations with colleagues, obviously without naming names, do you have a sense that there are things beyond where we are today that this administration could do that might mean there'd now be a majority in the House, for example, to, block certain funding, to perhaps even pursue impeachment charges? I mean, I wonder if you have any private sense of things that haven't happened yet that would be bellwethers.
So I have a lot of friends who are Republicans. I co-chair the Rare Earth Elements Caucus, which Trump has taken a real interest in that, mostly because I think Elon needs, rare earths for his EVs, but he's taken an interest in that. And then I work with the Republicans on that. I chair the Precision Medicine Caucus, and I have a great relationship on the Cyber Subcommittee where I'm the ranking member with my Republican colleague. And I have to tell you, they are terrified of being the tallest poppy in the field. And it's not as simple as they're afraid of being primaried and losing their job. They've priced that in. They know that can happen. And I think 8 out of 10 of the people who voted to impeach him in the first impeachment are no longer in Congress. They either lost their primaries or they just saw the writing on the wall. It's more than that. It's more personal. It's their personal safety that they're afraid of. And they have spouses and family members saying, don't do this. It's not worth it. You will change our lives forever. We will require around-the-clock security. Life will be very uncomfortable for your children. So that is real, because when Musk tweets at somebody or Trump tweets at somebody or calls somebody out, their life is turned upside down. And I'm saying that as somebody whose life has been completely turned upside down. I've spent $1 million in the last 2.5 years just on security because when he tweets at you, people make threats and you have to take people at their word. And so that is a real thing that my colleagues, struggle with. And Ukraine is another one where I thought that what he's doing to Ukraine and the numbers we've showed to be unified around Ukraine, would hold, and it's not holding. But as I have to step off to get ready for this town hall, I want to ask you all a question because this is a real concern, and it's, I think, more likely than we probably imagine. And we should have the imagination to see this coming, knowing what Trump has already done. If the Republicans do not have the votes to keep their government open and Democrats hold strong, and there is a Trump shutdown, would Donald Trump be willing to essentially just say, the hell with Congress, I'm going to keep government functioning, I'm going to have the agencies that I like continue to function, I don't need Congress anyway, I have the Treasury, I know, how the payment systems work, et cetera, with Elon. I mean, would he be willing to do that instead of working with Congress? And what Republicans would speak up and stop him? I don't know. I'm just trying to be very imaginative with where this could go and what off-ramp he could find if he found himself in a Republican caused shutdown. Because I could see him going there. And it's hard to say that out loud, but I could see him going there.
I mean, I'll dive on that grenade first, I guess. I think, Congressman, I think there would be, just a universe of Anti-Deficiency Act litigation at that point, right? Where the question would be not so much Trump, but whether you'd have lower level officials within the executive branch, willing to risk not just adverse court orders, Congressman, right? But whether they'd risk, contempt fines and the various other things. I mean, then that would, I think, even further sharpen the conflict between Trump and the courts. And I think, my question at that point would be, who would be left in the boat with him and who would actually within the, even within the executive branch start pushing back because, whatever you think of all these other arguments, the notion that the federal government, the notion that the executive branch can just operate the government single-handedly without appropriations, I think would have zero legal support from anybody.
I hope. Yeah. I hope. Okay. Well, Sidney, I got to jump. But I, as I told you, I see this effort by you all, and I'm grateful that you all care enough to stay in the fight, is the beginning of a conversation. And so, Sidney, please share my cell and email with anyone on the group who you think it would be helpful for.
Thank you very much, Congressman, and good luck in the town hall, and good luck going forward. And you pointed out coming crisis that I think many people need to start thinking about. And now I'd like to raise a question with Brad that the congressman raised about being targeted, because you're dealing with people who are being targeted. And not only that, but your law firm is being targeted by Trump. There's a recent article in the last day or two in the New York Times about your law firm and Trump designating you as an enemy within. What happens to people when that happens? What's that like, and what can be done about it? And furthermore, can anyone be held responsible for this level of intimidation that goes on? And is the law capable of dealing with it? And I know those are the issues you're grappling with now.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've actually been dealing with it dating back to the first impeachment back in 2019, 2020. If you all remember, the whistleblower coming out of the intelligence community blew the whistle, went to both a colleague of mine first, and then we brought it to Congress, to the Intelligence Committee, and to the Intelligence Community Inspector General regarding the quote unquote perfect phone call between Donald Trump and Zelensky regarding that whole extortion scheme. dating back to then, Donald Trump has had it out more or less for our firm in particular, but also any lawyers who have pushed back on his actions. It's not just us. You look at Letitia James, you look at Alvin Bragg, and this was even before they actually, sued or prosecuted him. Anyone who pushes back, he'll call out by name. And it's obviously, when it's a public official, when it's Congressman Swalwell, when it's Letitia James, there's access to public resources, taxpayer funding for security. When it's us, when it's a private firm, we don't have that. We have to go to other sources in order to be able to fund private security. So back during the first impeachment, Donald Trump literally held up a photo of my boss, called him out by name, said he was scum, was a liar, et cetera, et cetera. Next day, I woke up to like 150 voicemails, texts were, flooded throughout my inbox. We were getting death threats like crazy. And there was actually at least one gentleman who went to prison for making threats against my boss, Mark Zaid, threatening to kill him, and then mouthed off further to the FBI, which didn't really help his cause. But that was more or less the exception, not the rule. What we saw there back in 2019, 2020, and what we're seeing now with the more recent action where he's literally stated, at least through a press release, nothing's happened yet, but he said through a press statement that he's revoked my boss's security clearance, is that he will take whatever action he wants, knowing he has complete immunity, knowing there's no real way to push back and stop him. We publicly called him out back during impeachment when he was threatening the whistleblower in public statements saying, you are putting this person's life in jeopardy. You need to stop. You need to stop trying to identify them. You need to stop trying to dox them. He made clear he doesn't care. He'll say it's not my fault if something happens to that person. He'll say it's not my fault when someone went after my boss. He'll say it's not my fault if someone goes after me. Or if he were to call out Professor Vladeck or Sean, he won't take responsibility. He knows full well the intimidation factor he can bring through his bully pulpit. The man is quite possibly the greatest communicator I've seen in the 44 years I've been on this planet. Some people on this panel have been around longer. He can gather a group, a mob, better than anyone I've ever seen, with passion. And that is a huge threat when it's done for something other than noble purpose. It's not done for, in the spirit of patriotism. It's done for nefarious reasons. It's done to intimidate, to threaten, to terrorize. And that is one of the biggest concerns is the system's not designed for this. And it quite candidly isn't really meant to be, because our founding fathers, their warts and all, had an idea in their mind of the kind of men and eventually women who would serve in the role of the president. And they didn't envision a Donald Trump.
A question that is raised here on the Q&A is whether anybody can be held responsible in the Trump administration for the damage they're doing to individual government employees and individual citizens who are being injured, are victims of their private information being taken, and all that portends potentially. I wonder if there is anything in the law that provides for a remedy. I wonder, Steve, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean there are remedies. The problem is that the remedies are not going to be effective, or at least they're not going to be complete. So just a couple of quick points. I mean, long before the Trump administration, the Supreme Court had taken a healthy bite out of a long line of cases that had made it possible to obtain damages when federal officers violate our constitutional rights. Congress, folks like me had been pushing for Congress to reform that for years, and Congress sat on his hands. So it won't be damages. maybe it will be if benefits are wrongly withheld, restitution of benefits. If jobs are wrongly terminated, reinstatement. The kinds of coercive decrees that put back what was wrongly taken away, or that undo what was wrongly done. The problem with that universe of remedies, Sidney, is that it might mean on the far side of this that the law is stable and the rules are where they're supposed to be. But man, there's going to be a lot of chaos between now and then. And that chaos is not just horrible for all the people who are directly affected by it. That chaos also means building it back is going to be difficult. I mean, just think about how much damage the administration has done just to the reputation of the Justice Department in the last 4 weeks. DOJ's reputation matters in all kinds of ways that we don't think about a lot. I mean, when federal prosecutors go before juries in criminal cases, there's an expectation that those prosecutors are turning square corners. I don't know if that expectation is going to hold anymore. When federal scientists say, we think this vaccine is the safest way to respond to this pandemic, I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to trust that science anymore. And so there are legal remedies that I think could eventually prove sufficient to sort of undo the legal harms. But the real world and reputational damage is going to take a hell of a lot longer to fix. And that's why the indolence on the part of congressional Republicans, the fecklessness, I think has been so disastrous because, when it comes time to fix it, it won't be their problem.
Yeah, I wrote an article that appeared this weekend in The Guardian about what happened in the Senate and how Trump torqued the advise and consent process for the confirmation of his cabinet nominees to be able to make the Senate submissive to him through techniques of intimidation. And so he's turned the Senate into something like a reflection of what he's done already to the House. Sean, I wonder if you have a historical perspective on the nature of the damage that's being done to checks and balances, basic American institutions, what's called the administrative state in a denigrating way by the right wing, but in fact is what we also call the civil service.
Yeah, well, it's called the government of the United States at some level. I mean, it's the accretion of everything that's happened since the buggy whip, years of, the 19th century. And so what they're really doing is they've demonized not just the government, but they've demonized a particular kind of government. Their idea of government is something that is so reactionary it's difficult to comprehend. But actually, to the point where you wonder if people are going to get upset if their Medicare gets cut, or if their Medicare gets cut. You wonder if people are going to get upset if their Social Security gets cut, because they've so demonized everything that the federal government does that it might take a while for people to figure it out. Because they think that somebody else is getting away with more than they're getting away with. We've never seen anything like this in modern history. I mean, it's just as simple as that. I'm getting bored of having to say this so many times. Never, 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 never. Except for the attempt of Nixon to try to concentrate power in the executive. What it's going to take to re-legitimize what we're talking about, I frankly don't know. I mean, because it's difficult to imagine how you're going to get any word out. I mean, we have our webinars. We're doing the best we can. But the fact is that it's that even writing in the way we could have written 10, 15 years ago to try to reverse this, it's in an ecology of information and misinformation that's very, very difficult to penetrate. I hate to sound so gloomy about all of this, but I don't think there's anything like it before, and I'm not quite sure how we're going to get rid of it. But it has to do with, yes, the delegitimization of the government. That's the key, I think, in all of these things.
Yeah, how conscious is it, Sean? How do you think, in terms of dealing with it, people should respond? They feel I think emotions of helplessness and anger and flailing. And I think that that's something that those in the Trump administration, those feelings are what they want to produce.
Well, precisely, and that's true for every strong man. I mean, you see it, throughout history. The best way to rule a people is to demoralize them, and to give them the sense that anytime they speak up, either through a regime of terror or just a regime of complete hopelessness. I think actually what the congressman said, what Congressman Swalwell said, was very important, which is that you do have to look to the next horizon. You do have to look to the next battle that you can concentrate on. If you look at the whole scheme as we're doing in this conversation, how are you going to undo everything that's going on? That's not going to get you very far. You're going to feel more hopeless. What I think you can do, however, is pick your battles, as he said, and define those places on the next horizon. Well, what are we going to do next, and to mobilize around that? And in that way, I think it's not so much that you're necessarily going to win these things, but you are going to keep people engaged. My great fear is that people are going to get disengaged. We're already finding it, that people feel as if they just can't do anything. That's what strong men want. They've always wanted it that way. It was true in Germany in the 30s. It was true in Italy in the 20s. It's true. It was true in Brazil. I mean, you see it all the time. It's a regime of fear. And part of the element of fear is that if people have any hope at all, it's just going to be dashed. That's what has to be overcome. It's a psychological as much as anything else process. But I think that if you stick to the short and the middle range, you give people something to fight for that they can see as in their best interest. That's the way to do it.
What, Brad, do you see is the role, and your specialties national security, that misinformation and disinformation is playing, and how are they manipulating it? It's crucial to what you're dealing with.
Yeah, it's quite possibly one of the most difficult fights of the current generation. And, kind of going to what Sean was just saying, it's almost like we got a little kiddie, bucket, and we're trying to hold back an ocean. Because for all of these, the podcasts, the webinars, the conversations amongst educated, competent professionals that we can have with all of these individuals who are, graciously and thankfully watching us, it is a drop in the bucket compared to the TikTok, compared to what's out there on Twitter, compared to what's on Instagram, compared to the Joe Rogans. It is just a mass of information, and there's no interest, or I should say there is less interest compared to the past in terms of finding out what's actually factual and what's actually evidence-based. What's evidence-based. Now it's what sounds emotionally right. What are the vibes? What fits my predetermined narrative? So you've seen a lot of this with Doge. The whole concept of Doge, the whole reason that Elon and Trump were going to do this was there was going to be massive fraud in the government. They had already decided from the outset, there's massive fraud in the government. So step one, it already exists. Step two, we're setting up a team. We're going to find the massive fraud. Okay, set up a team. Step three, we've gone in. You can't just say, oops, we didn't find much. Donald Trump doesn't do that. Donald Trump doesn't lose. Donald Trump always wins. So what have they done? We've gone in, we've found massive fraud. Elon's posting every piece of garbage data he can find, information from the Social Security Administration that his 22-year-old kids don't understand. They think there's 150-year-olds collecting Social Security. They're not. It's an antiquated coding system. These kids have never seen it before. It predates me, let alone these, system administrators working at Doge. But this is what they work off of. This is what makes for great clickbait. This is what gets attention and views and engagement on social media. This is what you see on podcasts. This is what you see on Fox. This is what you see on Newsmax. That's how this information ecosystem keeps circulating the information. I come across people now in here in Northern Virginia, qualified, well-educated individuals who I knew were longtime Republicans, who are repeating to me the $50 million worth of condoms in Gaza line. And I'm sitting here trying not to slam my head against the desk going, are you kidding me? You're really believing this garbage. But that's how this has worked. And so to go forward, the biggest fight we're going to have, and this is not a partisan, this is as a society, is do we find a way with these great technological advancements we've made with social media that brings everybody together to find a way to find consensus on what is fact and what is accuracy and what is evidence-based? Or is going forward, are we just a society that says it's whatever I feel like it is? You know, plants crave Brawndo. That's why we're going to feed them that instead of water. You know, is that where we're going with this? Because there's nowhere else, there's nowhere else to go with it. We're running out of ways to convince or show the public, here's reality. Here's the facade they're showing you. But if people want to believe the facade, you can only do so much. They'll go with what they want to go with.
Yeah, it's interesting, Brad, that the delegitimization of fact and evidence go hand in hand. And what's happened through Fox and Friends, even becoming Secretary of Defense, and many other Fox personalities, shows the thin membrane between all of this and the Trump administration. But also, as an analogy, isn't the undermining of fact in the right-wing media ecology analogous to the undermining of law, so that no one thinks about law anymore? It's as law, it's something else, and it's not factual. That's your opinion.
Yeah,
it's just an opinion. It's not the law. And if you're opposing what they're doing, that's illegal. That's just your opinion. I wonder, Steve, how you feel about the undermining of the law as a process.
I mean, I think that's certainly part of the story, but it's worth stressing, they still need the law. I mean, the bad thing, I mean, even if you view this all as a cynical attempt to line their own pockets, they need courts to enforce their contracts, right? They need, legal structures. I mean, we're seeing an effort right now in Delaware to rewrite the Delaware corporate law in ways that would favor Elon. I mean, right, these are not entities, these are not people or entities whose end game is a world without law. It's just a world with law that only benefits them. And I think what's striking about that is I don't know how you split that difference with anything that could possibly and principally be called law. I mean, what it really is at the end of the day is Führerprinzip. It's the notion that, what they want to do and what they say they can do is law and nothing else is.
Correct. That's right.
And that's still a conception of law. And it's still a world in which you need courts. It's just not the rule of law, because it means that the law is not what the courts say it is. The law is what the president says it is. And I think, I think there's, I'm a bit of two minds of this. I think a lot of the guardrails that have kept us from having to have this conversation seriously have been removed or are proven ineffective. I still think there are some guardrails that are left. And so I think the question is, how do we bolster those guardrails? And to me, part of it is by reminding folks who don't pay as much attention to politics as we do, and who don't take an hour and a half from their time on a random, Tuesday afternoon to talk about this stuff, why a trustworthy government matters, why a functioning government matters, why, what their lives would look like in a world in which they can't rely upon the safety of their food or their cars or anything else in their lives. And I just think that that's where the narrative has to go, and not, here's today's reason why what Musk is doing violates the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Like, that's not how you're going to persuade the people on the street. And I think that's the gap between the conversation that folks like I and my sort of fellow lawyers are having, right, and the conversation that the politicians ought to be having.
Yeah, I wonder, Sean, if you could provide us with a conclusion here, in which we are reminded of the fundamental framework of the American government, back to the original idea, not originalism, but in Hamilton and Jefferson, of Hamilton, the idea of the executive, and Jefferson, the idea not only of liberty, but the role of information, of an informed citizenry, and both of them, and Madison as well, with in the framework of the law. Lincoln, of course, said, I find it ironic that the Trump administration has provided new guidelines for the National Endowment for the Arts, and particularly focused on the American Revolution, which was, of course, the founding against an authoritarian tyranny and despotism. And perhaps there should be a lot more discussion about the American Revolution now.
Well, absolutely.
So I'll turn it over to you, Sean.
Well, here we are. I mean, we are at the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. It is upon us. In my little world, there's going to be a great struggle as to what story is going to be told. Whether it's a MAGA American Revolution, which is entirely possibly going to be promoting. I don't think they're going to do a very good job of it. I don't think it's going to necessarily be very compelling. But how do you get across the idea that, yes, we are a nation that fought against precisely what these, well, not only what these people are representing, but that rather our founders were completely gripped by or gripped with fear at the possibility of something like Donald Trump coming to be. I mean, even Alexander Hamilton, who was supposedly Jefferson thought that Hamilton was dangerous because he thought of Julius Caesar as a great figure. Well, Hamilton was very, very frightened of a Caesar-like character coming along, of creating this republic that is very, very, what should we say, republics are always vulnerable, and they are very much aware of that. Now, how can we get that across? I don't know. I mean, we try. We're trying the best we can. But you know, the syndrome that I find so difficult here is that this is not just coming from the right wing, or it's not just coming from Fox News. And I remember, Sidney, when you and I were, in one of our first political struggles together during the Clinton impeachment, and I went before the House Judiciary Committee, and I was saying, here's what the Constitution actually says regarding high crimes and misdemeanors. And it was just straight, what the facts actually were. And I remember a Republican member of the Congress saying, well, that's just your opinion, sir. And we all have our opinions of what the Constitution matters, and we're going to go with our opinion and not yours. Now, that was a very early sign of what we're up against. It's a kind of reactionary postmodernism, that there is no fact, there is no truth, that it's all a matter of power and position. And that was raised first as a critique of liberalism, and liberalism is under attack from the right and the left. That's what we're being left with. And it's a very, very difficult thing to try to break with because of the power of the media as we're talking about it. So I don't mean to sound helpless. I mean, I think enlightenment can indeed conquer over superstition, but we got quite a fight on our hands.
Well, thank you all for joining us today on the Court of History. We're going to do further webinars as these events proceed and continue to offer civic education, which is the mission of our project. And I'm appreciative for everyone who's attended it, this event, and you will be able to get a video of it and a transcript. Feel free to circulate it, to post it wherever you want, to share it with people. So for now, so long, and we'll be back. Thank you.
Welcome back, Court of History. They've got dozens of amazing podcasts, videos. Sometimes it's Sidney and Sean. Sometimes it's Sidney alone. Whenever they kibitz, you want to listen about the intersection of law, politics, and history. And they're coming on here 4 or 5 times a week. You can find them in a playlist under Court of history. So glad, so honored to have Sidney Blumenthal and Sean Wilentz here, and just the quality and depth of their work, which I think our audience, and they've already demonstrated it, our audience is just eating up. Hopefully you're eating up Legal AF. Take a moment, stop eating. Go out and hit the subscribe button and help us continue to grow this pro-democracy channel. We are the resistance. We are talking truth to each other, and we need your help. And then we got a Legal AF Substack. The things we talk about on Legal AF, the legal documents, the court filings, you may want to see them for yourself. So I post them on the Substack. Just find us on Legal AF, of course. I do a morning rundown. I call what else? The briefing, Morning AF. And then we also have other contributors doing a lot of other work there, videos there, ad-free versions of our podcast, all on the Legal AF Substack. So until my next report, I'm Michael Popak. Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.